Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Peter Coleman for the DePaul University Certificate in Financial Planning Program. I'm in Connecticut broadcasting over the high-speed internet. This is Estate Planning 115, specifically session number 2 is covering wills, intestacy, as well as probate. And there are a couple of key things we're going to be covering today. And for starters, my email in the lower left-hand corner is pcolema6@depaul.edu. If you have any questions, feel free to send it to me there, and also I'll give you my phone number. In the lower left-hand corner is 203-747-4722. Feel free to use either email or phone. We're going to start out today's class with slide number 2 right here. Wait for this slide to come up. I just hit the advanced key. Here we go. Testamentary distribution. Specifically on this slide, testamentary distribution, this is valid for anybody with a will that's in place when they die, and it's valid. It's basically signed by the decedent. It's in good order. The testator, who is the deceased, is the person that is in charge, and he would name the executor or the executrix, who after the individual passes away, the executor will make sure that the will is followed according to the terms of the testator. The last point going down the page here is all wills pass through the probate process. And I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions on this slide here. Otherwise, let's continue on this. We're going to go over here to the next slide, specifically post-death property transfers. When people die with a valid will, as I mentioned, it's going to go through the probate process. The probate process is court supervised by the state. If somebody does not have a will that's active, if they don't have a will in place, the absence of a will will result in the intestacy laws. Basically, a person would die intestate, meaning they don't have a valid will in place. The court supervised will. The court supervises the supervision of it. They're responsible for all the accountability of it. Also, if there are any creditors that want to make claims to the estate, the court will make sure that they're valid claims. If for some reason there could be some disadvantages to somebody having a will could have costs can be quite a bit higher because legal fees could be higher. The time to settle the will could be quite a bit longer, meaning it could go upwards of possibly 6 months to a year, year and a half. I've seen them go to as long as 2 years. The longer it takes for an estate to settle through the probate process with a will, the more it costs. So there can be delays, possibly, if somebody challenges the will. And also, all wills are public. The information is public when somebody passes away. Information can be published in the newspaper. So all that is public. Basically, it's a costly procedure, and it may delay the distribution of the assets to the decedent's estate. It does provide the heirs and also the beneficiary with a means of obtaining a clear title to the decedent's property. So basically, in a nutshell, the probate is a process that is used to make an orderly distribution of the property from the decedent to the beneficiaries. The probate is a process, and it's characterized by court supervision of all the property that's being transferred, filing of the claims against the estate, possibly by the creditors, and also the publication of the last will and testament for decedent when they die is done through a valid will. And I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments here. And while we're doing that, we're going to go over here to the next slide. And let's go over here to actual assets that are potentially subject to the probate process. Assets that are individually owned. For example, if you own an automobile, that's individually owned, that automobile, when you die, would go through the probate process. If you have a checking account at the bank that's just titled in your name only, that's individually owned, that would go through the probate process. So all assets that are individually owned pass through the probate process. Also property that's titled tenants in common, TIC, passes through the probate process. Community property, in the 9 community property states, all assets that are community property pass through the probate process. Also, any asset that is made payable to the estate, for example, if somebody has an IRA account with a named beneficiary, and if the named beneficiary is the decedent's estate, or if somebody has a life insurance policy with a named beneficiary, and if that named beneficiary is the decedent's estate, those assets would be payable to the estate and also subject to probate. So again, to repeat, assets that are subject to probate are singly owned assets, assets that are titled tenants in common, assets that are owned in community property states, okay, such as Texas, Wisconsin, California. And the last point is that all the assets where the beneficiary designation is the estate. And again, there are 4 groups of assets that are subject to probate. They're individually owned assets for which the beneficiary has been made, okay, for which there's no beneficiary that has been made, I meant to say. Tenants in common, as we mentioned earlier. The decedent's 1/2 interest in community property. Again, a community property. There are 9 community property states. And the last point, as we mentioned earlier, assets for which the beneficiary is the decedent's estate. I'll just pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments on this. Otherwise, let's continue on this, going over here to the next slide. And wait for the slide to come up. And let's go over here to slide number 5. Here's a great question. For which one of the following assets is most likely to be subject to the probate process? Let's look at A, B, C, or D, and I'll give you a moment to make your selection. Feel free to type in the lower left-hand corner if you'd like. And we'll give you 1 or 2 more moments. And let's go over here. The correct answer is A, as in alpha. The decedent's individually owned automobile would be an asset that would be most likely subject to the probate process. And I'll just pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments here. Otherwise, let's continue on this. We're going to go over here to the next slide. And wait for the slide to come up. And let's go over here to slide number 6, probate avoidance strategies. A number of key points to go over on this slide here. The main points going vertically from top to bottom. Trusts, all trusts, avoid the probate process. Also, if somebody wants to avoid the probate process, they can do it through gifting, which is a second point going down the page. If they have an automobile and they don't want the automobile to be caught in the probate process, they can simply gift it to another family member, to their grandchildren, whoever it is. Okay, so gifting assets gets it out of your estate, excuse me, and it avoids the probate process. The third point going down the page are assets where the designated beneficiaries are named in a qualified plan, such as a 401k, excuse me, a 403b, have named beneficiaries, IRA accounts, avoid the probate process. Also life insurance policies with named beneficiaries as individual people, They avoid the probate process when the individual passes away. The assets go directly to the beneficiary, avoiding the probate process, as well as annuities. Annuities could be fixed or variable annuities. Annuities have named beneficiaries, and those assets avoid the probate process. Closer to the lower part of the page, third from the bottom, POD, payable on death. That is with accounts at banks and things. If somebody has a checking savings account, whatever it is, it could be a CD, certificate of deposit. Those accounts can be set up at the bank as payable on death with a named beneficiary, the person that owns that checking account. Nobody else has access to that checking account while the owner of that account is alive. Nobody can go in and take the money. But the day that the person passes away, or the hour that the person passes away, where the account at the bank is titled POD, payable on death, the named beneficiary can go into the bank with a death certificate, retitle all the assets that are in the bank, and walk out with a check. So POD, bank accounts at banks, avoid the probate process. Similar to that are transfer on death, TOD accounts. TOD accounts are used for brokerage accounts, mutual funds, and things like that. If a person has an individual account at Fidelity or Merrill Lynch or wherever it is, if they have stocks and bonds and mutual funds, whatever they have there, they can set up that account in their name, also POD, transfer on death, to a named beneficiary. Again, the individual that owns that brokerage account, the person that owns the mutual funds, nobody has access to those funds. Nobody has power to buy or sell. Nobody else has power to take money out except for the individual owner that's still alive. When the owner passes away, then the named beneficiary, all the assets are retitled over to the named beneficiary, and the named beneficiary owns those assets. Again, it's avoiding the probate process. The last point going down the page you may see more often are accounts that are titled Joint with Rights of Survivorship, JTWROS. Joint with Rights of Survivorship can be somebody's home. A home could be titled Joint with Rights of Survivorship, checking account at a bank, a brokerage account, mutual funds. Pretty much any asset can be titled Joint with Rights of Survivorship. Assets that are titled Joint with Rights of Survivorship, that's typically with two or possibly more people. Again, it could be a husband and wife, mother and daughter, brother and sister, two friends. Joint with Rights of Survivorship, when the first person passes away, the second person has full ownership of all the assets, and it avoids the probate process. Again, payable on death, as we mentioned, that's for cash, bank accounts, and things. It would have a named beneficiary. Upon the death on a POD, it would be payable to the person, to the new person that is the named beneficiary. The deposit would be complete. The person that owns it has full control of it, but when that individual passes away, the beneficiary would end up being the owner. Transfer on death accounts, as we mentioned earlier. This is for the benefit of another individual. And transfer on death account is basically transfer on the death of the original owner. It's not transfer on death of the beneficiary. And again, the owner, the original owner, has complete control over all the securities, stocks, bonds, and mutual funds until death. POD accounts are revocable. The owner can change the beneficiary at any time. If the owner puts one grandson as a beneficiary and then a year or two later the owner wants to change the beneficiary to possibly another granddaughter or intermediate family member such as a son or daughter, named beneficiaries are revocable. And again, the significant part of a person's estate that is transferred pursuant to a contract, again, a contract or any one of these things here, joint with rights of survivorship, annuities, things like that. Typically, contracts are beneficiary arrangements that we mentioned with life insurance policies, annuity contracts, all retirement accounts like IRAs and pension plans and 403bs. All these assets avoid the probate process. And I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments here. And while we're doing this, if one or two of you could kindly text message me in the lower left-hand corner as to the audio quality, if you can hear me okay. If you'd like me to speak louder or softer, move the microphone further away or closer, your input would be greatly appreciated. In the meantime, let's go over here to the next slide and wait for the slide to come up. Let's go over here to slide number 7. Specifically, why does one person, an individual, need a will? Okay, a will is basically a means to communicate whom that individual wants to receive their assets when they die. If somebody dies without a valid will in place, the state is going to decide who gets what assets without regard to any of the transferor's wishes. For example, if you don't have a will in place and you wanted to make a charitable donation to a local nonprofit, it could be a church, it could be a sports facility, it could be a university. If you wanted to do it, you could do it in your will. If you didn't have it in your will, then the state is not going to know what you wanted, and there would be nothing accomplished according to your wishes. And we'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments here. Otherwise, let's continue on this, going over here to the next slide. And continuing with wills, we're going to go over here to slide number 8. Specifically, a will is a legal document that contains instructions for the disposition of property. When somebody dies, how are those assets going to be disposed of? For a valid will, there are a number of things that have to be in place to make that will valid. Number one, when we're looking a third of the way down the page here, the individual making the will, the owner of the assets, they have to be competent. It has to be an adult that is creating this will. So they have to be competent. Also, halfway down the page, the will needs to be signed by the person that owns the assets. Also, the will needs to be witnessed by other people. And then as we move closer to the lower third of the page, handwritten wills are known as holographic wills, definitely testable on the national exam. If for some reason somebody wants to give an oral will, let's say they're up on Mount Everest or up on the mountain or out in the middle of the ocean and they're in a life raft, whatever it is, hypothetically, an oral will could be accepted, but an oral will, which again, if you see oral will on the national exam, that's a non-cupitive will, and again, it's definitely testable. An oral will or a non-cupitive will must be witnessed. Okay. And we're going to review a couple of key points on the valid wills. A will is a validly executed document that would dispose of the individual's assets and all the assets that an individual owned upon the date of their death. If a valid will is found when the individual passes away, the decedent is said to have died testate. If they die without a valid will in place, they're said to have died intestate. And again, the legal requirements for a will to be legally enforceable, it must conform to the specific legal requirements of the state for which it's created. For example, the state of Illinois has its laws, the state of New York has its laws, the state of Connecticut has its laws. So it has to be valid according to the state for which it was created. And again, as we mentioned, there are different types of wills. A witness will, it can be written, can be handwritten, it can possibly be typed as well. But a witness will that is written or typed must be witnessed. as opposed to when we're looking at a holographic will. Okay, the holographic will, as we mentioned earlier, must be in the testator's handwriting and must be signed by the testator. And as we mentioned previously, the non-cupative will, again, we're reviewing this because it's highly testable, heavily tested on the national exam. The non-cupative will are oral wills that are done in the presence of a witness, and it's used in near-death situations. Again, the requirements: testamentary capacity. The person has to be an adult. They can't be under the influence of alcohol when they're doing it, under duress. There are different forms of wills. There are typewritten wills, or there could be witness wills. Again, there could be holographic wills. There could be non-cupative wills. And again, to sum this up on testamentary distribution, basically, simply put, when an individual passes away, a person making the will is called the testator, and the will is said to make testamentary transfers. The actual process by which the transfer is accomplished is through the probate process, which is public and controlled by the state. The testamentary trusts also go through the probate process, as does the will. And I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions or comments on this so far. Otherwise, we have about 20 minutes to get all this done. I want to thank you all for a great class. If you have any questions, I'll stick around after class. Again, thank you all very much, and we'll see you all on session number 3. Have a great day. Bye.